In a stone room beneath ancient Egypt, a man spent 40 years trying to turn lead into gold and failed. But somewhere in those 40 years, he discovered something far more valuable, something we have spent the last 3 centuries trying to unlearn. He never found his gold. Historians barely remember his name. And yet the notebooks he left behind, smudged with soot and sealed in clay, describe a process so precise, so deliberate, that modern psychologists reading them for the first time assumed they were looking at a therapy manual. They were not wrong. What that nameless man was really working on, in the flickering orange light of his furnace, was not metal at all. It was his own mind. And the strange, uncomfortable truth is that he understood something about human consciousness that our best hospitals, our best universities, and our best technology still have not fully caught up to. We like to think of alchemists as fools, bearded men in dusty robes, hunched over bubbling flasks, chasing a childish fantasy of free wealth. That image is not an accident. It was built deliberately over hundreds of years by people who had very good reasons to make sure nobody took alchemy seriously again. But strip away the caricature and look at what alchemy actually was, in its own words, in its own century, and a very different picture appears. Alchemy was practiced from Mesopotamia to Egypt, from Persia to India, from China to Korea to Japan, through classical Greece and Rome, through the great libraries of the Islamic world, and into the heart of Renaissance Europe, for at least 2,500 unbroken years. No superstition survives that long by accident. Something in it kept working, kept proving useful, kept getting passed down from teacher to student in secret for 2.5 millennia. The question worth asking is not whether alchemy was real science in the modern sense. The question worth asking is what problem it was actually solving, generation after generation, that made it worth protecting with codes, symbols, and blood oaths of silence. The oldest roots trace back to Egypt, to a practice called Khamaya, named after Kem, the black fertile land along the Nile. Egyptian priests worked in temple laboratories, refining metals, distilling plant essences, embalming the dead with chemical precision that still baffles modern chemists. But the priesthood did not separate their material work from their spiritual work. To them, there was no line between a chemical reaction and a psychological one. Fire did not just melt metal. Fire, in their understanding, also burned away the impurities of a human soul. Water did not just dissolve substances. Water dissolved the false, hardened parts of a person's identity so that something truer could take shape. Every operation performed on matter in that temple laboratory was simultaneously a map for an operation to be performed on the self. This was not metaphor for its own sake. It was method. The physical process was a controlled demonstration of a psychological process, something you could watch happen in a flask before you attempted it inside your own mind. This is the part almost nobody tells you. Turning lead into gold was, for the vast majority of serious alchemical schools, never actually the point. It was the cover story. In a world ruled by kings who wanted free wealth and churches who executed anyone caught practicing anything resembling forbidden knowledge, you did not announce that you were running secret experiments on human consciousness. You announced that you were trying to make gold. Kings funded you generously for that lie, because greed made them patient. Inquisitors left you alone a little longer, because greed looked less heretical than mysticism. Underneath that convenient cover story, encoded diagrams and symbolic language designed to be unreadable to outsiders, alchemists were mapping something else entirely, the architecture of the human mind, and a repeatable process for transforming it. The starting point of every alchemical operation was something called the prima materia, the first matter. In the laboratory, this was the raw, unrefined, often disgusting base substance the alchemist began with, before any purification took place. But symbolically, and this symbolism was not decoration, it was the entire point. The prima materia represented the unexamined self. It was consciousness in its rawest, most chaotic state, before it had been touched by discipline, reflection, or honest self-observation. Every person, the alchemists argued, begins as prima materia, confused, reactive, driven by impulses they do not understand, carrying wounds they have never looked at directly. The alchemist's task was never to force something foreign onto that raw material. It was to reveal what was already hidden inside it, patiently, without violence, without shortcuts. This single idea, that transformation is not about becoming someone new, but about uncovering something that was always latently present, is one of the oldest recorded theories of psychological growth in human history. And it appears in alchemical texts written more than 1,000 years before the word psychology existed. To work on this raw material, the alchemists needed fire. But not all fire was the same, and this is where the tradition becomes almost unnervingly specific. Later, alchemical and Renaissance texts describe 4 distinct types of fire, each with its own symbolic in the body and the mind to a larger process of transformation. There was elementary fire, the ordinary physical flame that heated the furnace and drove the visible chemical reactions. There was central fire, the internal heat believed to animate living things, the vital warmth of a beating heart and a working body. There was celestial fire, the influence of light and cosmic forces on matter and mind alike, the sense that a person is never separate from the larger universe acting on them. And there was secret fire, the most guarded and the most important, the fire of consciousness itself. Paracelsus, the controversial physician and alchemist whose ideas reshaped European medicine, wrote extensively about this secret fire. He believed that disciplined imagination, focused and sustained attention directed inward, was not a passive mental activity, but an active force capable of shaping new outcomes, both in matter and in the self. In his framework, imagination was not daydreaming. It was a tool, precise enough to be dangerous in untrained hands and powerful enough to be the actual engine behind every genuine transformation an alchemist claimed to achieve. Strip away the 16th century vocabulary, and what Paracelsus is describing sounds remarkably close to what modern cognitive science calls directed attention and mental imagery, the same mechanisms now used in visualization therapy, in trauma treatment, and in elite performance training. He did not have brain scans. He had furnaces and centuries of careful observation. And he arrived by a completely different road, at a strikingly similar conclusion. At the center of the entire tradition sits a short, strange document called the Emerald Tablet, attributed to a legendary, possibly entirely fictional figure named Hermes Trismegistus. The text is barely a page long, written in dense, riddling language, and yet it became the single most influential document in the history of Western esoteric thought. Its most famous line, translated countless times across countless centuries, states that what is below corresponds to what is above, and what is above corresponds to what is below, so that the miracle of unity may be accomplished. On the surface, this reads like abstract cosmic poetry, but alchemists used it as an operating instruction. It meant that the structure of the outer world and the structure of the inner world were not separate systems obeying separate rules. A change in one reflected, and could produce a change in the other. When an alchemist watched a substance in a flask pass through darkness, then whitening, then a golden transformation, he was not simply observing chemistry, he was watching an external demonstration of an internal process that his own consciousness was capable of undergoing, if he had the patience and the discipline to walk through it deliberately, awake, rather than being dragged through it unconsciously by suffering as most people are. That internal process had a name. The alchemists called it the Great Work, the Magnum Opus, and they described it in 4 distinct stages, each with its own color, each mapping directly onto a state of the human mind. The first stage was called nigredo, the blackening. In the laboratory, this was the stage where the original material was broken down, decomposed, reduced to a dark, formless mass, often described as putrefaction. Psychologically, this stage represented confrontation. It was the deliberate, unflinching encounter with everything a person had been avoiding about themselves, their shame, their unacknowledged rage, their grief that had never been allowed to finish. The nigredo was not depression in the clinical sense, the way we use that word today, but the 2 states share an uncomfortable amount of territory. It was descent. It was darkness entered on purpose, because the alchemists understood something that modern culture, obsessed with relentless positivity, has almost entirely forgotten. Nothing genuinely new can be built on top of material that has never been allowed to fall apart first. You cannot skip the blackening and arrive honestly at the gold. The second stage was albedo, the whitening. Having passed through the darkness of the nigredo, the material began to purify. Impurities separated out and were washed away, and what remained grew clearer, lighter, more refined. Psychologically, this was the stage of clarity after collapse, the quiet, often unglamorous period where a person begins to see themselves without the old distortions. Old defenses, the stories a person told themselves to avoid pain, started to dissolve, and something more honest took their place. This is not a dramatic stage in most accounts. It is slow, it is patient. It looks, from the outside, almost like nothing is happening at all, which is exactly why so many people give up on their own transformation at this exact point, mistaking quiet integration for stagnation. The third stage, Citrinitas, the yellowing, receives less attention in most modern retellings, and yet alchemists considered it essential. It represented the dawning of understanding, the first light of a new awareness rising after the long night of the nigredo, and the patient clearing of the stopped being abstract and started becoming usable, where a person who had confronted their own darkness and purified their perception began to actually apply what they had learned in real decisions, in real relationships, in the actual texture of daily life. The final stage was rubedo, the reddening, the completion of the great work. This was the philosopher's stone itself, though almost no serious alchemist believed the stone was a literal object you could hold in your hand and press against lead. The stone was a state. It represented a person who had passed through destruction, purification, and illumination, and had emerged whole, integrated, no longer at war with the darker parts of themselves, because those parts had already been faced, understood, and folded back into a larger, steadier identity. The treasure the alchemists spent their entire lives pursuing was never external. It was their own awakened consciousness, achieved the hard way, through a process that could not be rushed, faked, or purchased. Gold was never really the goal. Gold was simply the closest physical metaphor they had for describing a psychological state that had, until that point in human history, no proper vocabulary of its own. It is worth sitting with how deliberately structured this four-stage journey actually was, because that structure is the part modern culture keeps rediscovering without giving credit. Each stage had its own required duration. Each stage had its own set of warning signs for a practitioner moving too fast, forcing an outcome before the underlying material was actually ready. Alchemical manuscripts are full of cautionary stories about impatient students who tried to skip straight from blackening to gold, who tried to manufacture the appearance of wholeness without ever actually descending into the darkness first. Every single one of those stories ends the same way. The shortcut fails. The false gold cracks under pressure, revealing the same unrefined material underneath, because nothing was actually transformed, only disguised. This is, in essence, the oldest recorded warning against what modern therapists now call bypassing, the attempt to leap toward peace. And integration, while skipping the uncomfortable work of confronting what is actually broken. The alchemists had no clinical term for it. They simply called it failure. They built an entire symbolic language specifically to help future students recognize the difference between an honest transformation and a convincing imitation of one. Long before any of this reached Europe, the tradition passed through the Islamic Golden Age, where it was refined into something closer to a genuine experimental science. Scholars working in Baghdad and across the wider Muslim world developed careful laboratory techniques, precise measurements, and systematic classification of substances, building the actual technical foundation that later European chemistry would inherit almost wholesale. One figure in particular, often called the father of early chemistry, wrote extensively about the purification of the self as a necessary companion to the purification of matter, insisting that a practitioner who had not first disciplined his own character had no business handling the deeper secrets of transformation. This was not a side comment, it was a stated requirement. You could not be trusted with the physical work until you had already proven through years of discipline that you understood the psychological work. That single requirement, quietly embedded inside a tradition we now remember mainly for its glassware, tells you everything about what the people actually running these laboratories believed was truly at stake. For centuries, this entire body of knowledge was kept alive quietly, passed between masters and initiated students, encoded in symbols specifically designed to be meaningless to anyone who had not been personally taught how to read them. And then, starting in the 17th and 18th centuries, a new intellectual movement swept through Europe, and it had no patience for any of this. The Enlightenment demanded that knowledge be measurable, repeatable, and stripped of anything that smelled of mysticism. Science and spirit, which the alchemists had always treated as two views of a single underlying reality, were violently pried apart. Chemistry kept the furnaces, the distillations, the practical laboratory techniques, and it became, quite rightly, an extraordinary and rigorous discipline that has saved and improved countless lives. But the other half, the psychological half, the map of consciousness that had justified all that laboratory work in the first place, was thrown out as embarrassing superstition and largely forgotten. What almost nobody learns in school is just how many of the founding figures of modern science refused to let that psychological half go. Isaac Newton, the man who gave us the laws of motion and the mathematics of gravity, the towering symbol of cold, rational scientific achievement, spent more of his private working life on alchemical manuscripts than he ever spent on physics. He wrote well. Over 1 million words on alchemy, almost none of it published in his lifetime, kept deliberately hidden because he understood exactly how it would look to his scientific peers. For centuries after his death, this fact was treated as an embarrassing footnote, an old man's eccentric hobby, something historians politely skipped over. But contemporary historians, who have actually read those manuscripts in full, have started arguing the opposite. Newton did not treat alchemy as a distraction from his real work. He treated it as a parallel investigation into a different, equally real dimension of nature, one that his public mathematics could not reach. He was not the only serious thinker who felt this way. He was simply the most famous one willing to keep the notebooks. Robert Boyle, often credited as one of the founders of modern chemistry, spent years pursuing alchemical transmutation in private, even while publishing the rigorous experimental work that would help define the scientific method itself. These were not unsophisticated men fooled by superstition. They were among the sharpest minds of their era, and they kept returning to alchemy because something in it continued to feel unfinished, worth pursuing, even after the rest of the world had decided it was safe to laugh at. It took the 20th century, and one particular Swiss psychiatrist, to bring the psychological half of alchemy back into serious conversation. Carl Jung stumbled onto alchemical texts almost by accident, while searching for historical parallels to strange symbolic material appearing in his patient's dreams. And what he found stopped him cold. The imagery in centuries-old alchemical manuscripts, images of death and rebirth, of darkness giving way to light, of opposites being forced together and fused into something new, matched, almost exactly, the imagery his patients were independently producing in their own unconscious minds without ever having read a single alchemical text in their lives. Jung said, in his own words, that only after he had familiarized himself with alchemy did he fully realize that the unconscious is not a static storage room but an active process, one that develops through the ongoing relationship between the conscious ego and the deeper contents it usually avoids looking at. Studying these old, dismissed manuscripts became the foundation for what Jung eventually called individuation, his central concept for the lifelong process by which a person integrates the fragmented unconscious parts of themselves into a coherent, whole identity. He came to believe the philosopher's stone was never a literal object the old alchemists were chasing. It was a symbol, an externalized image of the self they were actually trying to construct inside their own minds, expressed in the only vocabulary available to them at the time, the vocabulary of metals, fire, and matter. Jung also offered an important warning alongside his discovery, one that keeps this whole story honest rather than turning it into simple ancient wisdom worship. He argued that the alchemists were engaged in a process of unconscious projection. Working alone in their laboratories, watching their own inner transformations reflected back at them in bubbling flasks and shifting colors, they experienced their own unconscious material as though it were literally a property of the physical substance in front of them, without ever fully realizing that the real transformation was happening inside their own skull, not inside the glass. This matters because it means we should not romanticize alchemy as some perfect, complete, forgotten science of the mind that modern civilization tragically abandoned. It was a group of serious, dedicated people working with limited tools, no formal vocabulary for psychology, and centuries before anyone had access to a single controlled study. What they built was not a finished map. It was an early, remarkably sophisticated sketch of territory that we are, even now, still exploring. And that is precisely what makes the last several decades so strange, because that sketch keeps turning out to be accurate in places nobody expected. Modern neuroscience, working with brain imaging technology the alchemists could never have imagined, has begun describing states of consciousness that map with uncomfortable precision onto the old four-stage structure of the great work. Researchers studying meditation, deep grief processing, and intensive psychotherapy consistently describe a pattern that looks almost identical to nigredo, albedo, citrinitis, and rubedo, even though most of these researchers have never opened a single alchemical text. There is typically a difficult period of confrontation, where old patterns and defenses have to be consciously faced and broken down before anything new can take their place. There is a quieter period of integration that follows, often mistaken by patients for a plateau, where the nervous system slowly recalibrates around a more honest picture of the self. There is a period where insight becomes usable and begins actively reshaping behavior. And there is, for those who complete the process, a final period of stability, where the person genuinely feels more whole, less reactive, less at war with themselves, because the parts of their mind that used to operate in secret have finally been brought into the light and integrated. Clinical research into supervised psychedelic-assisted therapy, still in its early and carefully regulated stages, has produced some of the most vivid modern echoes of alchemical language. Patients undergoing these treatments frequently describe experiences of ego dissolution, a temporary breakdown of their normal sense of self, followed by a period of profound psychological reorganization, and often a lasting sense of integration and wholeness afterward. Clinicians reading these patient accounts for the first time have occasionally reached for the exact same word the old alchemists used centuries earlier, describing the process as a kind of death and rebirth. Nobody involved in that modern research is trying to revive alchemy as a discipline, but the fact that trained scientists, working from an entirely different tradition with entirely different tools, keep landing on the same underlying pattern the alchemists described in the language of furnaces and fire deserves more attention than it usually gets. Trauma researchers studying the nervous system have separately arrived at a strikingly similar structure without any reference to alchemy at all. The body, they have found, does not process overwhelming experience in a single motion. It requires a period where the old frozen response is finally allowed to surface and be felt, often decades after the original event, followed by a slower period where the nervous system gradually learns that it is safe again, and only after that does anything resembling genuine resolution become possible. Skip the first stage, and the frozen material stays frozen, showing up later as anxiety, numbness, or a kind of chronic unease that has no obvious cause. This is functionally the negredo, described in the vocabulary of modern trauma therapy, instead of the vocabulary of a 16th century furnace. The names have changed. The underlying architecture has not. Even outside clinical settings, the pattern keeps resurfacing. People who go through major life upheavals, the loss of a marriage, a serious illness, the collapse of a career they had built an entire identity around, often describe an almost identical sequence when asked to narrate what actually happened to them internally. First, everything they thought they knew about themselves falls apart, sometimes violently, sometimes over a slow and disorienting stretch of months. Then comes a quiet, unglamorous period of just getting through each day, rebuilding almost without noticing it, that in hindsight looks exactly like the patient clarification the alchemists called albedo. Then, gradually, understanding arrives, often in a single, unexpected moment, where the entire ordeal suddenly makes sense in a way it never did while they were living through it. And finally, for those who make it all the way through, there is a settled, integrated calm that people almost universally describe as feeling more like themselves than they ever did before the collapse began. Ask someone who has actually lived through that sequence whether it can be rushed, and they will tell you, without hesitation, that it cannot. That instinctive answer is the same answer the alchemists spent 25 centuries writing down. None of this means the old alchemists had access to some perfect mystical truth that modern science lacks. They did not have brain scans, they did not have controlled studies, placebo groups, or peer review. Much of what they wrote was genuinely confused, tangled up with astrology and superstition that has not aged well, and plenty of alchemical. Writing really was exactly what the caricature suggests, greedy men chasing an impossible shortcut to wealth. But underneath that noise, a smaller, more serious tradition was quietly doing something worth remembering. It was treating the transformation of consciousness as a discipline, not a mood, not an accident that happens to you if you are lucky. A discipline, with stages, with recognizable landmarks, with the understanding that you have to move through darkness deliberately before you are entitled to any kind of light, and that nobody gets to skip the parts of the process they find unpleasant. We live in a culture that has largely lost patience for that kind of structure. We want transformation to be instant, packaged, available in a weekend course or a single dramatic breakthrough. The alchemists would have found that idea almost laughably naive. They spent decades at their furnaces because they understood, at a level modern self-help culture rarely reaches, that real change in a human being follows its own timeline, and that timeline cannot be negotiated with. The blackening has to be allowed to happen. The whitening cannot be rushed. The gold, if it comes at all, comes last, and only after everything false has already been burned away. There is something almost humbling in realizing how much modern effort has gone into rebuilding, piece by piece, a structure that already existed, fully formed, in manuscripts we spent 3 centuries mocking. Entire careers in psychology, entire fields of clinical research, entire libraries of self-help writing are quietly circling back. Toward conclusions, the old alchemists reached by candlelight, using nothing but patience, close observation, and a willingness to sit with discomfort long enough to understand what it was actually trying to teach them. We did not lose this knowledge because it was disproven. We lost it because it did not survive the transition into a world that demanded everything be provable within the lifespan of a single research grant, measurable on a chart, repeatable on command. Some truths about the human mind refuse to move that fast, no matter how badly we want them to. And the alchemists, whatever their flaws, whatever superstition got tangled up in their work, at least had the patience to let those truths unfold on their own terms. So think back to that nameless man in his stone room beneath ancient Egypt, feeding his furnace for 40 years, watching lead refuse again and again to become gold. By the metric he claimed to be pursuing, his entire life's work was a failure. But if you read his notebooks the way Carl Jung eventually learned to read them as a map of an inner journey disguised as a chemistry experiment, his life looks entirely different. He was not failing to make gold. He was documenting, with extraordinary patience, what it actually takes for a human being to face their own darkness and come out the other side changed. That knowledge did not disappear because it was wrong. It disappeared because it was inconvenient, unmeasurable by the new rules science eventually adopted, and easy to mock once nobody remembered what the symbols actually meant. We forgot it, quietly, over the span of 3 centuries, one dismissive footnote at a time. And it took a Swiss psychiatrist reading dusty manuscripts by candlelight, long after everyone else had stopped looking, to remember what the fire was really for,